Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me well. Okay. Thank you very much for being here this morning. It's really my pleasure to welcome all of you to this side event titled Implementing Humanitarian Law, Innovative Programming and Best Practices in the Age of COVID-19. This event is organized by CIVICS, the Center for Civilians in Conflict, whom I'm the Europe Director, and with the co-sponsorship of Switzerland, the Federal Republic of Germany, and the Kingdom of the Netherlands. We are very grateful also for the support of OCHA and the ECOSOC organizers. We're particularly happy to have this event take place this morning for an organization like CIVIC that's committed to the protection of civilians. Our approach is very much anchored into international humanitarian law and building on it, looking at the question of the how to foster better IHL implementation, and how to implement IHL better through better policies and practices. Ultimately, the goal is to change practices and policies, but also change behaviors, change mindsets, and get to a reduction of civilian harm. And at CIVIC, we believe that even when the political environment might be sometimes less conducive to protection, or when we're facing very hard situations on the ground, there is a wide range of tools and approaches which are available to national and local actors who are committed to better protect civilians. So there are many ways through which we can contribute, all of us, governments, states, civil societies, armed actors, to better civilian protection. During this side event, we will walk you through different tools and approaches that have been developed by a variety of stakeholders, from higher level institutional solutions all the way to very tactical field-oriented initiatives. And as conflict contexts have not been spared by COVID-19, we will also discuss the specific protection threats which have been posed by the pandemic, and share examples of creative ways through which communities and armed forces and civil society on the ground have overcome the additional challenges. We're also particularly happy to have this conversation today in the context of the Humanitarian Affairs segment of the ECOSOC, and especially as it takes place this year in Geneva, because it offers us the perfect platform to get together as governments, civil societies, field practitioners, UN agencies, humanitarian actors, to discuss very practical ways forward. So before handing over the floor to our distinguished speakers, just would like to get back to a couple of housekeeping rules, as we are all very used to them by now. The first one is about the Q&A. We are very lucky today because we have a rich topic and a lot of interest in this conversation. So please do use the Q&A function of Zoom as we're speaking. During the panel, we will select questions and address them during the final Q&A session with our speakers. You can also choose to upvote questions so that your questions are addressed, or the questions that you're interested in are addressed in priority. With regards to the translation, two of our speakers will deliver a remark in their language, so we therefore invite you to click on the button on the bottom of your screen to get the English translation. And finally, in terms of time management, we're very privileged to have a very rich group of speakers and panelists here today, and participants. So the moderator will have the very difficult task to make sure that everybody speaks within the allocated amount of time. So with this, I'll hand over the floor to His Excellency Dr. Hans-Peter Jugel, the Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative of the Permanent Mission of the Federal Republic of Germany in Geneva, for introductory remark. Ambassador Jugel, thank you so much for being here with us this morning, and over to you.
Thank you, Beatrice, very much for giving us the chance to participate in this very valuable and important side event, especially with the focus on implementing and emphasizing implementing, since there is humanitarian law in place. But what about the respect for international humanitarian law, implementing and accountability? Last year, the Secretary General has called for a global ceasefire to enable a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet, conflicts have continued, as have violations of international humanitarian law by parties to conflicts. In many instances, the situation for civilians has been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, and we continue to witness a horrifying number of deaths among civilians in conflict zones due to indiscriminate attacks or even deliberate targeting. Hospitals and healthcare workers have continued to be deliberately attacked. Sexual and gender-based violence persists in many conflicts. Enhancing respect for international humanitarian law is of utmost importance to Germany and partners participating today in this webinar, especially so in light of the alarming number of violations of international humanitarian law in current conflicts, as well as the increasing number of attacks on humanitarian personnel we are witnessing. We are using all international fora to advance this issue. During our membership in the Security Council in the last 2 years, we have constantly pushed for accountability for violations of international humanitarian law. Here in Geneva, in the Human Rights Council, we have supported investigative mechanisms to gather and preserve evidence on violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, such as in Syria and in Myanmar. Germany and France have launched the humanitarian call for action as a concrete contribution to strengthening respect for international humanitarian law and principled humanitarian action. This call has already been endorsed by 48 states from all continents and the European Union. Sharing examples of and exchanging good practices of national implementation measures taken in accordance with international humanitarian law obligations is an extremely valuable tool to help strengthening international humanitarian law. We are thus very interested in the discussion today, which will highlight such concrete examples and best practices on overcoming challenges to the protection of civilians on the ground. When the German Ministry of Defense held a similar event some time ago on translating UN protection of civilians policies into national frameworks, regional and national frameworks for the protection of civilians, such as the ones of NATO, the African Union, as well as the Swiss and the Australian national framework, it became clear that this can contribute to the protection of civilians in conflict. So we will be very carefully listening today to the examples and best practices presented by practitioners today to see how we can support you on the ground and in international fora to ensure the protection of civilians and the upholding of international humanitarian law. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Hugel, for this very important introductory remarks, and thanks for emphasizing the importance of accountability for violations, indeed, as an important component of implementation of IHL, as well as the national frameworks. I would like to now hand over the floor to Ms. Wafa Said, who is Director of OCHA's Coordination Division, and will help us as well to set the scene before we get to the panel. Wafa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I just want to make sure that you can hear me. Yeah?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, thank you so much. I think Your Excellency, Ambassador Hugel, and all distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this very important event, which, as we've seen from the introduction, promised to explore a range of perspective and good practice in the application of international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians in armed conflicts. As we know too well, hostilities in today's armed conflicts continue to be characterized by high levels of civilian death, injury, psychological trauma, and damaged and destroyed homes, schools, markets, hospitals, and essential civilian infrastructure. And when explosive weapons particularly are used in populated areas in 2020, we have a total of 88% of those killed and injured were civilians. So the use of explosive weapons in urban areas takes a devastating toll on an essential infrastructure, destroying and damaging water, electricity, sanitation infrastructure, and disturbing essential services. So it's not just a direct impact on the people themselves, but also the essential services that are very essential for their lives. And now, 5 years on from the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2286 on the protection of medical care in armed conflict, violence, threats, and attacks against medical care also still persists, sadly, I would say. And combined with the conflict, now we're seeing the COVID-19 pandemic is intensifying human suffering and placing enormous strain on weakened healthcare services. The facts on the ground are very disturbing and require urgent remedial action. As this important side event will expose, some parties to the conflict have developed and implemented good practices to avoid and minimize civilian harm in hostilities. And so it would be very good to learn from these good practices and to expand them. And indeed, the Secretary General has recommended that member states develop national policy framework that build upon good practices and establish clear institutional authorities and responsibilities for the protection of civilians in the conduct of hostilities. And just to share with you a few of these good practices, first, simply avoiding the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. Second, strengthening the identification of civilian objects, including through no-strike lists that include medical facilities and other essential civilian infrastructure. Establishing also capabilities to track and learn from allegations of civilian harm, and establishing standard operating procedure for post-incident management, including preserving evidence, fact-finding, and reporting. And His Excellency the Ambassador referred to the importance of evidence, preserving evidence, and fact-finding. And as the Secretary General and OCHA have been advocating for many years now, such good practices must be expanded and must be applied across the system. And this side event today, I think, will make an important contribution to our collective efforts to develop, share, and implement good practices to protect civilians in armed conflict. I really look forward to learning from the various experts on the panel and to the rich discussion that will undoubtedly follow. Thank you so much, colleague. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wafa, and thank you so much, Ambassador Ugel, as well, for these introductory remarks. I would like now to hand over to our moderator for today, Anne-Derit Matten-Patino-Meyer, which is the Head of Office Humanitarian Affairs of the Permanent Mission of Switzerland to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva. And I'm sure a lot of you on the line know her already. So Anne, thank you so much for accepting to be our moderator today. I hand over the floor to you now for the panel.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. Thank you so much for giving me the floor. And of course, let me just immediately start by saying how delighted I am to be with you this morning. And I'm very much looking forward to moderating this upcoming conversation with our very distinguished panelist. Before I hand over the floor to our first panelist, maybe allow me to make a few remarks in my national capacity. Indeed, my country, Switzerland, is engaged on the promotion of international humanitarian law and human rights, for that matter, since a number of decades. We were one of the first countries who developed a national protection of civilian strategy, and we recently published a report on the national implementation of international humanitarian law. Switzerland also hosted last year in Geneva an expert meeting on the protection of the medical mission, which identified a number of good practices. And I think another element I would really like to highlight are the critical role of national IHL committees. They exist in a number of member states already. And in our view, they're an excellent instrument to ensure a whole of a government approach to the implementation of IHL obligations. On another note, of course, I would like to briefly mention that Switzerland supports CIVIC, especially in its multilateral engagements. We regularly work with CIVIC as a chair of the group of friends in New York. We really find that CIVIC is an incredible advocate, both in New York and in Geneva, and one of the really key actors for putting the protection of the civilian agenda very much in the forefront of those conversations, and we very much value the work that they are doing abroad. And so this is why I was particularly pleased when Beatrice asked me to moderate this session that Civic is organizing today, because of the close partnership that we have with this key actor. If I may now, let me just maybe briefly come back to the conversation itself for this morning. I think when thinking about this event with Beatrice, we really hope to have a very dynamic, interactive conversation. I think my recommendation would be for participants on the line to maybe already start now reflecting on some of the questions that they would like to put forward to the panelists. Please use the chat. You can also start typing those questions when the conversation with our speakers is unfolding. Maybe one or two recommendations, I think, from our side, which we think would be very interesting to maybe raise in the questions that you would want to put forward. We had thought about questions also that could be interesting to pose for our panelists. I think they could be clustered into 4 main leading questions. I think the first one, which was very much highlighted by our distinguished panelists just now, is this question about best practices and innovative approach to civilian harm mitigation. How can that be further adapted and replicated in other contexts? Another element we'd be very keen, of course, to reflect on is how do large-scale outbreaks impact national implementation of international law by member states? And of course, again, what are the best practices and lessons that we can learn from the COVID-19 crisis and previous epidemics? The last 2 of those reflections and questions, of course, is very much about how member states can support these national level approaches, and what should civil society participation in national level implementation could look like in practice. So very much grateful if maybe participants on the line could reflect on those 4 questions. And of course, we will try as much as possible to address all of your questions as they come forward once our panelists have been given the floor. So with that said, I now have the great honor to welcome our first panelist, who is Colonel Karpov, the head of CIMIC for the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Colonel Karpov is a regular interlocutor of CIVIC in Ukraine, so we're absolutely delighted to have him this morning with us. Colonel, I think if I may put a question forward to you, I think we would be very interested if you could share your experience in fostering armed forces engagement with civil society in communities in the context of the joint forces operation in Donbass. Colonel, welcome again to this conversation, and the floor is yours.
Да, добрий день, шановні колеги.
Good morning, dear colleague.
Дуже приємно, що запросили на дану конференцію, яка має дуже впливовий і змістовий зміст.
I'm very honored that I have been invited to participate in this conference of the very high level and filled with a very good content, I would say.
На жаль, в Україні триває збройна агресія Російської Федерації з 2014 року.
Unfortunately, the armed aggression of Russian Federation has been going on in Ukraine since 2014.
На даний час ми маємо тимчасово окуповану територію Автономної Республіки Крим.
Currently, we have the territories of Ukraine occupied, like Crimea.
Та активні бойові дії в районах Донецької та Луганської області.
And we have still active armed conflict in the east of Ukraine, in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts.
Як військові ми розуміємо, що у збройних конфліктах завжди страдає цивільне населення.
We as the military are fully aware that it is civilians who are deeply affected by the armed conflicts.
І завдання військового командування не тільки досягнути цілей військових, але зберегти цивільне населення від впливу озброєння, наслідків ведення бойових дій, це мінних загороджень та інших випадків небезпечних для життя цивільного населення.
And it is the tasks of the military commanders include not only achieving their purely military task, but it's about protection of civilians of various manifestations of harm, including landmines or unexploded ordnances or in many other ways.
І саме головне, військове командування розуміє, що на тій стороні, тимчасово окупованій або де знаходяться російські окупаційні війська, знаходяться наші громадяни України, які страждають від наслідків цієї збройної агресії. І наше завдання військових як можна більше зменшити вплив цього військового конфлікту на наше населення, що з цього боку, що з непідконтрольного боку.
And the most important thing that Ukrainian military commanders are fully aware that the civilians who stay in the non-government controlled areas are still our citizens, and we have to undertake all possible efforts in order to minimize harm to those civilians who stay in these territories.
Політичним керівництвом держави, військовим керівництвом держави ставиться чітке завдання щодо жорстокого дотримання військовими норм міжнародного гуманітарного права.
Our political leadership set a very clear and concise task for the military about the strict, absolute adherence to the international humanitarian laws norms.
На початку збройної агресії Російської Федерації Україна не мала досвіду щодо захисту цивільного населення. Тому що Збройні Сили України, як Збройних Сил України, так і політичні лідери держави зверталися і до теперішнього часу звертаються до міжнародних організацій щодо надання рекомендацій та допомоги в напрямку захисту цивільного населення.
At the beginning of the conflict, Ukraine and Ukrainian armed forces did not have any experience, didn't have any tools how to ensure protection of civilians in the armed conflict, and that was the reason why the armed forces approached the civil society and international organizations to acquire such experience.
Результатом безпосередньої роботи між військовим командуванням і організацією Civic стало в 2018 році підписання генералом Наєвим наказу про утворення робочої групи щодо збору та узагальнення інформації про випадки поранень та загибелі цивільного населення.
And the cooperation between the armed forces of Ukraine and the Center for Civilians in Conflict resulted in 2018 signing an order by General Lieutenant Naev, the Joint Forces Commander, on creation of the so-called Civilian Casualty Tracking Provisional Group with the functions to collect the data on harm to civilians.
Завдання цієї групи не тільки робота над статистичними даними, а й надання конкретних рекомендацій військовому командуванню щодо зменшення та запобігання втрат та жертв серед цивільного населення.
The Civilian Casualty Tracking Provisional Group functions include not only the collection of the data and analysis of this data, but also providing recommendations for the military commanders how to mitigate and how to reduce harm in the course of the armed conflict.
Результатом роботи даної групи можна бачити сухі цифри, які зафіксовані обліковою моніторинговою місією ООН. Так, в 2017 році з поранень та загибель цивільного населення складало 486 осіб, в 2018-му 238 осіб. Вже з моменту підписання у 2019 році жертв серед цивільного населення стало 167 осіб.
And we may see by dry figures how the civilian casualties are decreasing in Ukraine. For instance, in 2017, the number was 486 civilian casualties, both injured and killed. And this figure in 2018 was 238, but after the order on creation of this group was signed and it started operations, the actual figure decreased to 167 in 2019.
На жаль, ми не бачимо зворотнього зв'язку з таких дій з боку Російської Федерації.
Unfortunately, we can't see any similar practices or response from the other side, from the Russian Federation.
Вони продовжують розміщувати свої військові підрозділи в населених пунктах поблизу лікарень, школ, скупчення цивільного населення з метою прикриття своїх позицій або військової техніки цивільним населенням.
It is still the practice of the Russian Federation forces to place their positions, their unit, their military vehicles in the vicinity of the places where civilians live in many numbers, or any key points of civilian infrastructure like shops, markets, hospitals, and so on, and thus exposing them to potential harm.
І так як збройний конфлікт, він проводиться в гібридному форматі, то не тільки військовий вплив, а ми бачимо і вплив через засоби масової інформації, коли засоби масової інформації Російської Федерації зазначають про порушення норм міжнародного гуманітарного права з боку військовослужбовців Збройних сил України, але журналістами і європейських стран, і України ці фейки виводяться на чисту воду і спростовуються.
And as the conflict in Ukraine has a hybrid character, it is often the case when the alleged violations of IHL or the cases when civilians harmed are being promoted by Russian mass media, and armed forces of Ukraine are accused, but we could observe that very often it is the international mass media, European mass media, they refute such fakes and allegations.
І на завершення хочу сказати, що Збройні Сили України, вони не є якимсь закритим товариством, завжди готові до співпраці з міжнародними організаціями, що ми проводимо на практиці з однією метою – збереження життя та здоров'я цивільному населенню і зменшення впливу військових на життя цивільного населення.
And in the end of my speech, I would like to put a special emphasis that the armed forces of Ukraine is not a closed structure. We're always open to any cooperation with the international organizations and civil society organizations. This is our highest priority, to do our best in order to ensure protection of civilians in the armed conflict.
Colonel Karpov, thank you so much for sharing this national perspective. I think it was also very interesting that you were able to highlight the very concrete results of for your armed forces of your collaboration with Civic. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the translator for his excellent work and for being able to translate Colonel Karpov's contribution. My next speaker on the list is Caroline Boudot. She is advisor on the protection of civilians in the context of hostilities for the International Committee of the Red Cross. Caroline, we're delighted to have you with us this morning. As maybe I have done just now with Colonel Karpov, I'd be delighted if I could put forward a question to you, maybe to kickstart this conversation. I think what could be very interesting for us and for participants on the line is maybe if you could share from the ICRC's perspective how you witness basically how much healthcare facilities, staff and patients have paid a particular high toll in recent conflicts. And of course, again, what if you could introduce us maybe to, of course, the protection challenges that attacks against healthcare raise in those circumstances. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Excellencies and distinguished colleagues. And first, let me thank the organizers for this event and for inviting us on this panel. So thank you, Anne, for your question and for highlighting the high toll onto healthcare facilities and staff and patients during recent conflicts. And we've seen that 5 years after the adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 2286 on the protection of healthcare, we are not seeing any decrease in these attacks. So in terms of protection challenges, what we see is that medical facilities, personnel, and patients themselves are attacked by parties to conflict. And that's due to a disregard for international humanitarian law and obstruction or criminalization of the provision of healthcare in some cases. So medical personnel are threatened, abducted, and killed. Parties to a conflict also continue to misuse medical facilities and vehicles by employing them for military purposes. And in many countries, large areas remain off limits to health workers and humanitarian workers, and that's really both local and foreign alike. We also have the issue of blockades and sanctions and arbitrary boundaries that are established by states, non-state armed groups, and others that prevent the free movement of health staff and medical supplies and patients. And what's important is that the lack of health care services have both immediate and long-term effects. Of course, on the mortality and morbidity of the population, with a large number of wounded and sick civilians, combatants, and fighters suffering or dying unnecessarily, and with the suspension of preventive and curative health programs. But lack of access to healthcare also drives displacement and destabilizes communities. And rebuilding and restoring those systems and those services after a conflict often takes a very long time, and that in turn has an impact on the return of displaced people, and it can hamper developments and impede the containment of epidemics. And on this, of course, the COVID-19 pandemics has further underscored the importance of protecting healthcare and healthcare workers, because new patterns of violence and stigmatization have emerged in the last year at a time when the functioning and performance of the healthcare system is more critical than ever, and will continue to be. So that's a wide range of protection concerns that need to be addressed.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Maybe to continue and to build on that, and of course, given ICRC's incredible operational footprint, do you think you could maybe share with us some good practices, some good field measures that you have implemented, you have seen has had sustainable, long-term positive impact for the protection of healthcare?
Sure, and thanks for this question, because indeed, action to protect healthcare from violence is feasible and is within our reach. So I would like to highlight two positive experiences. So one is in the Philippines, so where at the end of the 5-month crisis in Marawi, with almost 50% of the city's medical facilities damaged or destroyed, and health workers displaced and traumatized, some healthcare authorities led an initiative to restore access to healthcare facilities. So in 2 hospitals in the area, the healthcare directors liaised with the head of the Philippine police in Marawi City to introduce a no weapons policy, which basically bans police and law enforcement officers from carrying firearms while on duty in the hospital, and requires all licensed firearms to be left at the gate. And in addition, so in June 2019, we brokered a coordination agreement between a local healthcare authority and the military unit operating in the area to address some of the many issues that were raised by health workers on the ground, such as passage through military checkpoints, the occupation of medical facilities by armed actors, and the disruption of routine healthcare programs during armed clashes. So that example really demonstrates how coordination between health authorities and security forces can work well. But if I may, I'll also share a second example, which is in Lebanon, in Ain al-Helway, which is a densely populated Palestinian refugee camp where security duties are shared between 15 or so armed groups. And health workers there were faced with weapon bearers entering hospitals and clinics, targeting staff and ambulances, and basically preventing sick and wounded people getting the care they need. So we worked with armed groups to foster a culture of accountability and promote behavior change. And following a process of consultation with healthcare providers, religious and civil society leaders, and with armed groups, we developed jointly with the armed groups a declaration to safeguard healthcare provision and protect wounded and sick people in the camp. And those groups then signed and pledged to abide by this unilateral model declaration during a public ceremony in front of health workers and civil representatives in the camps. And that initiative was successful because of the groundwork that we did with the local community and the armed groups. Also because armed actors felt as part of the solution and developed a sense of ownership and accountability because the recommendations really came from their own ranks during the consultations. And also because the involvement of the affected communities contributes to that accountability. And we still monitor those projects today, and we understand that they have made a difference on the ground. So there are grounds for hope. And during a recent meeting on the protection of healthcare in the framework of the POC Week in New York, we've heard more governments share some good practices and examples. So we have this, but much more needs to be done. And at the global level, all states, and not only those who are currently affected by armed conflict, need to take concrete steps to implement measures to protect healthcare. And because today we're discussing tools that aim at translating IHL into practice, I wanted, if I may, to highlight two of our recommendations and practical guidance that we've issued recently to list some very concrete steps that can be taken towards better civilian protection. So the first recommendation that we have is that states should review and, if necessary, amend their military doctrine and practice to strengthen the protection of the medical mission. And to assist in this, the ICRC has, with support from Sweden, we've issued a guidance document for the armed forces to present practical ways to better protect medical workers and equipment and safeguard access to healthcare during armed conflict. And that guidance touches on matters related to training, planning, operational readiness, and the conduct of domestic and extraterritorial military operations. And it looks at 9 focus areas and what can be done specifically in each of those. So including civil cooperation, precautions, checkpoints, and military operations in medical facilities. So this document really allows militaries to carefully assess and adapt their military doctrine and practice. And the second recommendation, and that's my last point, is that states acting in support of parties to conflict should place special emphasis on integrating measures to protect healthcare in their partnered military operations and other cooperation. And on this, we have recently issued a booklet on managing support relationships in armed conflict to reduce the human cost of war. And that booklet details those measures and opportunities to better protect civilians in relation to the protection of healthcare, but on many other issues as well. So I'll stop here, but thank you very much again for this event, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And maybe if I can just say thank you so much for first of all, reminding us of the critical direct, but also secondary impacts of attacks against healthcare. I think it's extremely important also to convey that message, especially as you mentioned, we're commemorating this year the 5-year adoption of the resolution 2286 on the protection of healthcare, but also for sharing with us some very concrete examples of how you can indeed trigger behavioral change when you also directly associate armed forces and, as you said, give them ownership empowerment for these behavioral changes. So that is indeed very inspiring for our conversation this morning. My third speaker this morning is Syed Ashraf Sadat. He's the head of the Civilian Protection Working Group of Herat. Syed has a long history fighting for the promotion of human rights, justice, and fighting against corruption in Afghanistan. Since 2015, he is program manager of the Afghanistan Civil Society Forum organization. Syed, before
بسیار تشکر که به من فرصت دادیم تا روند کار یک گروه محلی حفاظت از غیر نظامیان خدمت شما شرح بدم. سید اشرف سادات هستم، مسئول گروه حفاظت از غیر نظامیان ولایت هرات و مسئول افغانستان سیویل سوسایتی فورم ارگانیزیشن در زون غرب افغانستان. گروه کاری حفاظت از غیر نظامیان، میخوام امروز صحبت خود در پیرامون پرسش هایی که شما در اول برنامه مطرح کردیم به مو خلاصه کنم. گروه کاری حفاظت از غیرنظامیان ولایت هرات متشکل از 20 نماینده نهادهای مدنی و حقوق بشری فعال در زون غرب افغانستان و جامعه رسانه‌ای هستند که سابقه کاری 17-18 ساله در راستای تامین حقوق بشر و فعالیت‌های دموکراسی و پیاده حقوق انسانی داشتند. گروه در سال 2018 در اپریل 2018 به همکاری تکنیکی و مشورتی مرکز غیرنظامیان یا سیوک در ولایت هرات ایجاد کردید که در نخست ما در ترکیب این گروه 30% خانوار داشتیم و حالا خوشبختانه 50%، یعنی نیمی از اعضای این گروه زنان مدافع حقوق بشر و رضاکاران مدنی هستند. در کل اعضا یک دیدگاه مشترک برای این که آسیب‌های غیرنظامیان در جنگ‌ها به حداقل یا به صفر برسه در همین دیدگاه کار میکنن و فعالیت میکنن. هدف گروه رایزنی جهت جلوگیری از قربانی شدن افراد ملکی در جنگ‌های جاری افغانستان است و همچنین رعایت قوانین جنگی و مقررات بین‌المللی بشردوستانه و مسئولیت پذیری در قبال گروه‌های ملکی که در جنگ دخیل نیستند از سوی طرف‌های جنگ. همچنین نیاز تا گروه‌های دادخواهی باشند در جغرافیای مانند افغانستان که طرف‌های درگیر جنگ متوجه مسئولیت‌ها و تعهداتشان در چارچوب قوانین بین‌المللی بشردوستانه برای حفاظت از افراد ملکی بسازند تا افراد ملکی در منازعات آسیب ندیده و یا به عنوان سپر انسانی در جنگ‌ها مورد استفاده قرار نگیرند. همچنین محیط زندگی افراد ملکی باید از تعرض و انواع خشونت‌های مرتبط به منازعه به دور نگه داشته شود. اگرچه متاسفانه در شرایط کنونی فعالیت‌هایی را که ما برای غیرنظامیان انجام میدیم بسیار پرچالش است و پرمخاطره، زیرا در جنگ‌های 40 و چند ساله افغانستان بی سابقه که از این قبیل گروه‌ها شکل گرفته باشند تا طرف‌های جنگ متوجه خلاها و خطاهایشان در عملیات‌های نظامی بسازند. اما این گروه توانسته با سازوکارهایی که روی دست گرفته تا حد زیادی میزان آسیب‌ها به افراد ملکی در سطح محلی خوشبختانه کاهش بده. مثلا این که ما در گفتگو با نظامیان ما در غرب افغانستان پایگاه 207 ظفر از اردوی ملی داریم. در صحبت با اونها موفق شدیم تا موقعیت پولیگون در اولوسولی، یک از اولوسولی‌های را به نام گذره که به یک نزدیک به ساعت مسکونی بود تغییر بدیم و تا حد زیادی از پرتاب توپ‌های دیسی و کاربرد تسلیحات سنگین در محلات مسکونی جلوگیری کنیم. همچنین برای اینکه پاسخگویی به نگرانی‌های افراد ملکی وجود داشته باشد ما پیشنهاد کردیم که کمیسیون حمایت از افراد ملکی ایجاد کرده که این کمیسیون هم به هدایت شورای نظامی ولایت هرات به رهبری معاون قلوردو در سپتامبر 2020 ایجاد گردید تا از این رهگذر نظامیان به دغدغه‌های حفاظتی امنیتی افراد ملکی پاسخگویی داشته باشند. ما در طول دوره حدوداً 3 سال کاری خویش بیشتر از 50 دادخواهی که شامل کنفرانس‌های خبری، نشست‌های رو در رو، برنامه‌های اعتراضی، نشست‌های رسانه‌ای، نامه‌های سرگشاده، نوشتن سوگنامه‌ها و ساختن ویدیو کلیپ‌ها می‌گردید در کارنامه خود داریم که تأثیر بسیار مثبت در راستای کاهش آسیب‌ها به افراد ملکی و مسئولیت‌پذیری بیشتر گروه‌های مسلح از جمله خود نظامیان افغان بوده. مثلا ما در کنفرانس خبری پیرامون حفاظت از غیرنظامیان صدا بلند کردیم که شما جنگ می‌کنید ما قربانی میشیم، لطفاً جنگ توقف دهید. اعضای گروه به دم دروازه دفتر یونیما در زون غرب نیز تجمع کردند و نامه سرگشاده با آدرس دفتر یونیما تسلیم کردند تا به رهبری طرفای جنگ و همچنان کشورهای حامی طرفای جنگ برسانه. در آن نامه از روزافزون بودن تلفات ملکی ابراز نگرانی شده بود. در کل ما دادخواهی‌های مداوم داریم. به وسیله همین دادخواهی‌ها ما خود را در کشانیدن پای محکمه بین‌المللی جنایی در افغانستان برای بررسی تخطی‌ها سهیم می‌دانیم، چرا که چندین دادخواهی از این آدرس به حضور نماینده‌های از محکمه خب باعث شد که خوشبختانه امروز اعلان آمادگی کنه محکمه بین‌المللی جنایی که بیاید انمو به حساب جنایات جنگی بررسی کنه. بحث دیگه که به نظر من شاید جالب باشه من یادآورشم، سازوکارهای جندر در این گروه خیلی حیاتی و مهم بوده و حضور زنان در این گروه فعالیت‌ها و دادخواهی ما پررنگ‌تر ساخته و زنان گروه ما همه فعالان برجسته مدنی، مدافعان حقوق بشر، خبرنگاران و فعالان حقوق زنان هستند. که خوشبختانه نقش داشتن. یعنی نکته مهم از حضور زنان، از حضور معنادار زنان این بوده که نگاه عاطفی و انسانی آنها به مسائل باعث کرده تا در چانه زنی‌های خود با نظامیان حس انسان دوستی را در نظامیان تقویت کنند و در برابر آسیب پذیری زنان و کودکان نظامیان حساسیت بیشتری به خرج بدن و پیام‌های و دساتیر واضح به فرماندهان خود در سطوح عملیاتی در زمینه حفظ جان و مال افراد ملکی داشته باشند. در ابتدا این گروه از ظرفیت بالای برخوردار نبود و سازوکارهای مناسبی در دستور کار ما نبود که ما چگونگی تعامل و کار مشترک یاد داشته باشیم، که خوشبختانه با کمک تکنیکی سیویک و مسئول ولایتی دفتر و همچنان نهادهای چون صلیب سرخ در هرات برنامه‌های ظرفیت سازی روی دست گرفته شد. ما اصول دادخواهی آشناسازی اعضا با اصول بین المللی به شهردستان، سازوکارهای کار با اجتماع، آموزش‌های کار شبکه‌ای و کاهش و اصلاح آسیب به غیر نظامیان داشتیم. این ترنینگ‌ها خیلی موثر بود در راستای ظرفیت سازی اعضای ما. و همین ترتیب گفتگو بین اعضا و گروه در جلسات ماهوار یک فرصت تا غیر نظامیان در آن وضعیت غیر نظامیان به تحلیل بگیریم و دادخواهی داشته باشیم مبتنی بر شواهد از وضعیت غیر نظامیان. اگر من صحبت‌های خود کلا جمع کنم، رویکرد گروهی بوده تا همه بازیگران جنگ افغانستان متوجه جان غیر نظامیان بسازه، از طریق نوشتن و صدور اعلامیه‌ها، کنفرانس‌های خبری، نشست‌های روی در رو، نامه‌های سرگشاده و همچنین از طریق علما و بزرگان مناطق و محلی. خوشبختانه توفیق چندانی هم داشتیم. من به چند نمونه اشاره میکنم. مثلا در سال 2020 جنگ‌ها در ولسوالیای هرات شدت گرفت و مزارع زیادی از مردم در آتش سوخت و در زمان برداشت محصولات زراعتی مردم مجبور به ترک خانه‌های خود شدند که ما با دادخواهی و لابیگری موفق شدیم جنگ کاهش بدیم و در مناطق جنگی تعداد زیادی از افراد ملکی موفق شدند محصولات زراعتی خود به خانه برگردانند. همچنین در بسیاری از مناطق ما رایزنی کردیم که جنگ‌ها در مناطق مسکونی نباشه و از مردم سپر انسانی ساخته نشه که در این راستا نیز نقش گروه بسیار پررنگ بود. داستان‌های موفقیت زیادی این گروه داشته که فرصت نیست تا همه اینا رو بیان کنم. ما همچنان برنامه‌های برای حمایت از صلح و ختم جنگ نیز در کارنامه داریم. چندین دادخواهی داشتیم که مردم افغانستان باید صلح تجربه کنند. موضوع مهم دیگری که گروه کار کرده ریفردهی غیر نظامیان متاثر از خشونت‌ها به نهادهای کمک کننده بوده، مانند دفتر کمک که در افغانستان فعال است، صلیب سرخ و دیگر نهادها. خوشبختانه به اینا ما ریفر کردیم کسانی که آسیب پذیر بودن و متاثر از جنگ. در کل ما یک برنامه مدون سنجیده شده و کاربردی که دستور کار ما بوده تانستیم تا میزان موثریت فعالیت‌های خود بلند ببریم و شرایط به نفع غیر نظامیان در این اوضاع جنگی و کرونایی تا حد قابل لمس تغییر بدیم. فعالیت‌های ما برای حمایت و حفاظت از افراد ملکی یک پروسه دوامدار. ما برنامه‌های نوی هم در دستور کار خود داریم و می‌خواهیم چند فعالیت دیگر هم انجام بدیم. مثلا یکی از این فعالیت‌ها این خواهد بود که ما می‌خواهیم از این پس جرایم جنگی با دخالت مستقیم محکمه بین‌المللی جنایی بررسی بشه. دوم ما می‌خواهیم کمپاین‌های داشته باشیم تا طرفای جنگ در مناطق تجمع جمعیت جنگ نکنن و از شهروندان سپر انسانی ساخته نشه. موضوع این که قرار است با مسئولان نظامی زونقدر رایزنی می‌کنیم که در حملات شبانه و انداختهای خود دقت داشته باشند و در حملات کورد متاسفانه تعداد زیادی قربانی داشتیم ما در این اواخر. همچنین ما یک برنامه داریم که در پای یک نامه سرگشاده امضای صدها نخبه افغان بگیریم و با حامیان بین المللی گروه‌های جنگی ارسال کنیم که مردم افغانستان بیشتر از این طعمه اهداف خود نسازند. دیگه متاسفانه در این اواخر چند تا نگرانی دیگه در افغانستان خلق شده. ادعای مردم نسبت به اخذی و لطوکوب خودسرانه و رفتار غیر قانونی و باجگیرانه اعضای گروه‌های مسلح غیر مسئول که گاهن از طرف دولت ایجاد شده، مسلح شدن مردم عادی و نگرانی از افزایش تلفات ملکی همزمان با تشدید خشونت‌ها در ولسوالیا و مناطق مسکونی، گسترش جنگ‌ها باعث کرده که دولت و سیاسیون اقدام کنند به مسلح ساختن افراد جامعه که این اقدام میتونه تبعات بعدی بیشتری داشته باشه. و آخرین صحبت
Thank you very much, Sayed. I think I will have to ask you to conclude because we still have other what I think
تشکر. من میخوام در کل سازوکارهایی که ما روی دست گرفتیم در راستای حفاظت از افراد ملکی در سطح محلی تا حد کارساز بوده. با گذشت هر روز تجربه ما برای حفاظت از غیر نظامیان خوشبختانه بیشتر میشه و ما انمو سازوکارهای چانه‌زنی و تعامل با نظامیان بیشتر پیدا میکنیم از طریق نشست‌های رو در رو و خوشبختانه امروز پذیرش موجودیت این گروه در افغانستان یک چالش بود که خوشبختانه طرفای درگیر جنگ مخصوصاً دولت افغانستان موجودیت این گروه پذیرفته. حتی از طریق پیام‌هایی که ما مخالفای مسلح دولت دادیم اونا هم به نوعی به کارکرد ما در مناطق خود تقریبا تفاهم کردن. خوشبختانه با این رویکرد ما کوشش میکنیم که بیشتر طرفای جنگ به حفظ قانون بین المللی بشردوستانه بیشتر متوجه بسازیم که متاسفانه چنین چیزی در جنگ‌های افغانستان کمتر مشاهده شده. بسیار تشکر که برای ما وقت دادیم. من فکر میکنم زیاد وقت نیست که من صحبت‌های دیگه‌ای داشته باشم. اگر باز پرسشی بود من در خدمتتان هستم.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sayed. And thank you so much for sharing the incredibly invaluable work that you're doing in Afghanistan. I think also one key aspect, of course, is the work that you are doing together with women, how you are including them in your program. So it's also very interesting to hear from you, your gender-sensitive community approach to protection. Thank you again. And indeed, there might be some questions then coming
تشکر از شما که این فرصت مساعد کردین تا ما صحبت‌های داشته باشیم همراه شما.
My next speaker now is Major Samantha Laplante from the Canadian Armed Forces and the Dallaire Center of Excellence for Peace and Security. Major Laplante is an expert, child soldiers and women peace and security related issues. Today she's working as a researcher and a gender advisor with the Dallaire Center of Excellence supporting the NATO training mission in Iraq on the integration of gender perspectives in operation. Of course, this is also a very special commemoration. We're delighted to have you with us, Major Laplante, and also because you are celebrating the second year anniversary of the Dallaire Center of Excellence for Peace and Security, which it makes it even more delightful to have you with us today. Major, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne, and good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to speak with you today on behalf of the Dallaire Center of Excellence, and I would like to thank Civic as well as all of the moderators and the panelists for putting together this wonderful event. So if I can just kick off with how the Center of Excellence, the Dallaire Center of Excellence, supports efforts of armed forces to enable peace, security, and better civilian protection. I will essentially describe the creation, the mandate, and the current priorities of the Dallaire Center of Excellence. So the Dallaire Center of Excellence for Peace and Security, or DCOE as I would refer to it from here on out, explicitly links to a priority that was given by the Canadian government in support of UN peacekeeping. So specifically, the creation of the DCOE is linked to the 2017 Canadian-led launch of the Vancouver Principles in Peacekeeping and on the prevention of the recruitment and the use of child soldiers. Prior to the launch of the Vancouver Principles in November 2017, the Canadian Armed Forces was thinking about and had already taken action about the implications of child soldiers. So to this effect, we had the Canadian Forces Joint Doctrine Note, which was developed following discussions with Senator Romeo Dallaire, as well as other CAF members who had met challenges when facing
Is it me? I think we've lost Major Samantha Laplante.
Of conflicts involving child soldiers. The Vancouver Principles initiated a major shift from the focus from interaction with child soldiers to a focus on prevention. So as such, the Minister of National Defence of Canada announced the establishment of the Dallaire Center of Excellence to serve as an enduring platform on the prevention and use of child soldiers, and to this effect to advance Canadian Forces doctrine, training, and education in this area. So the establishment of the Dallaire Center of Excellence is the innovation, if you wish, which further allows Canada to advance with a group of experts to approach this problem space in a more coherent and coordinated way. So in terms of the Dallaire Center of Excellence's mandate, I would like to highlight two key aspects. So the first is that the Dallaire COE serves as a strategic defense enabler to advance related Government of Canada commitments and objectives. And this is through the enhancement and contribution of defense capability. By a strategic defense enabler, we mean thinking in specific areas related to peace and security where others do not have the capacity or expertise. So in other words, we're filling the capacity gap. The second area that I would like to address is that the DCOE's primary function is to respond to the strategic and operational training requirements of the Canadian Armed Forces. This initially includes support to doctrinal updates, training and education, and associated updates in support of the Vancouver Principles. So while the Dallaire Centre of Excellence will be initially focused on child soldiers in order to leverage Canada's leadership on this topic, the scope of the Dallaire Centre of Excellence could eventually be broadened into other emerging humanitarian security topics relevant to Canadian Forces Doctrine, Training, and Education. So this is reflected in the name chosen for the Centre of Excellence, the Dallaire Centre of Excellence for Peace and Security. So given the established mandate, the Dallaire Centre of Excellence's mission is to enhance the Canadian Forces' capability to deal with complex peace and security issues through research and professional-based analysis, expertise, and best practices, which contribute to policy, concept development, military training, and education. Since we take on the role of thinking in areas that other departments and organizations do not necessarily have the expertise or capacity, our vision is to be recognized for this expertise and how it enhances and enables Government of Canada objectives. We do realize that this is not a reputation that just comes hand in hand. It must be earned through time, collaboration, and expertise. So to achieve this vision, we've also established 6 strategic objectives, which really span across 3 main areas. So we have the up and out, the strategic objectives, which are framed around supporting and advancing Government of Canada international objectives. We have the objectives that are to support the Canadian Forces, members, so the down and in. And then we have objectives to engage with the broader international community, including other military entities, organizations, civil society organizations, NGOs, and academics. So pan-organizational and pan-domain. The final thing that I would like to touch on, and you will see here that there's a slide up right beside me on the screen, is the priorities of the Dallaire Centre of Excellence. But in order to explain the priorities, it's first essential to understand how we are framing our initial areas in current focus and the intersections or intersectionality of these focus areas. And we visualize this through the image that you see to the side. So given our initial mandate and priority area of work has been to focus on the implementation of the Vancouver Principles, you can see the topic of child soldiers as a center of gravity, which is propelling our current work. The remaining thematic areas show that although we recognize that in order to advance and address the prevention and recruitment of child soldiers, we need to embed our understanding in the broader context of children in armed conflict, vulnerable populations, and protection of civilians more broadly. We also recognize that these areas are informed by women, peace, and security agenda and broader considerations of human security. So to this effect, we've commenced research and engagements to understand how these areas connect, what are the implications of keeping them separate, et cetera. They're complex issues, there are no easy solutions. So part of our entire approach is that we need to bring different perspectives together in order to figure out how to understand it and what we do. So bottom line up front, we are looking at this in 3 different focuses and 3 different timelines. So our primary line of effort, if you will be implementing the Vancouver Principles. So that's a practical application, connection to the Vancouver Principles, Canadian Forces roles, responsibilities, and tasks. This includes updates to doctrine, training, etc. Our second line of effort is understanding the other issues, for example, the ones that are on this slide, how they are connected and how they link together, and what does this mean for defense in Canada. And the third is scanning and starting work to anticipate new issues that may arise in the broader domain of protection of civilians and human security. So what is going on across the world and how do we understand it? The Dallaire Centre of Excellence's work will be iterative and evergreen and in response to new developments and shifting demands and priorities as we move forward. Thank you.
Major Laplante, thank you so much for your contribution. I also realized that if you're joining us from Canada this morning, it must be very, very early for you. So No, maybe you're
I'm
not.
actually joining you from the Netherlands.
Oh,
yeah,
good.
I'm working remotely, so it's okay.
I was a bit afraid that you had to wake up really, really early. So, but thank you again. And really listening to you, we realize how critical it is to address this capability gap to really be sure that we can change behaviors and then also change the frameworks that go with it. So thank you for this excellent contribution and for sharing the work of the Center of Excellence for Peace and Security. My last speaker on the list, but certainly not the least, evidently, is Emily Knowles. She is a civil military advisor and a senior consultant at Civic. Emily is providing research, policy, and strategic advice on changes in military engagement, trends in armed conflict, and civilian protection. She's completing her research with Civic on the impact of the current COVID-19 crisis on the protection of civilians in conflict, and she will share with us preliminary findings from this research. Emily, great to have you with us this morning, and if you agree, I would be really happy maybe to put forward a question for you, which is, of course, given the current circumstances that we're all experiencing since now 1 year, I'd be very interested to hear from you. What is your perspective on how large-scale outbreaks impact indeed the national implementation of IHL?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. It's a really good one, especially since I think at the beginning of the pandemic, many organizations, and Civic included, were really worried about the potential double threat that COVID-19 could pose for civilians, especially in conflict-affected areas. Luckily, I would say, a year and a half in, what we've really seen is there hasn't been a global impact, or as to say, there hasn't been a universal impact of COVID-19 on protection challenges in fragile states. So, for example, if you look to the ACLED data for 2019 and 2020, violence against civilians has remained broadly stable, which is obviously worse than we would have hoped for. And His Excellency mentioned the hopes for a global ceasefire at the beginning of the pandemic, but it's equally not the same as the worst case scenarios that were being put forward about civilian harm during COVID at the beginning of the pandemic. But what this has meant for us is that you really need to look at a country by country basis, and even at individual communities, especially vulnerable populations within communities, to see those impacts of COVID-19 on protection issues. And there have been several, direct impacts. In some countries, we saw, the enforcement of lockdowns and curfews, in some cases at the beginning of the pandemic, being more fatal for civilians than the virus itself. It's also been a record year for returnees into fragile and conflict-affected states, with security forces detaining sometimes tens of thousands of people at a time, and hundreds of thousands of people crossing those borders, making those journeys, with some countries, unfortunately, not providing a huge amount of humanitarian access into those centers and not providing adequate conditions in others. And then vulnerable communities. I mean, just to give one example, for some indigenous communities across Latin America who enforced very strict movement restrictions around their communities to protect their vulnerable, especially vulnerable elderly, we've seen that having a real spike in violence against them from armed actors and organized crime, as movement restrictions in those areas also disrupted valuable smuggling routes for some. And then, as many of my other panelists have mentioned, there are those, indirect impacts. The fact that COVID-19 has been a hugely disruptive factor for many people trying to provide protection activities in conflict zones. As the ICRC have mentioned, sort of levels of violence against medical facilities have continued in many contexts. In some cases, they've got worse, not necessarily as an intentional strategy, but having a disproportionate impact on civilians seeking medical care in a really critical time. And then, of course, international assistance missions hugely hit. Lots of people having to pull out staff, freeze rotations, pause activities, rejig priorities towards, healthcare. Which also has an impact, especially on, some of that high level ministerial advising work with partners in countries with huge protection challenges, kind of really reducing the spaces for that protection dialogue, which is so important in ongoing conflict with, long-term consequences that remain to be seen. So I think those are some of the main protection challenges that we've been highlighting throughout our research.
Emily, thank you so much. If I may, just a quick follow-up question from my side, because it's so interesting to have you share with us those preliminary findings of your research. In the work that you have done, could you maybe share some of the innovative approaches that you have witnessed? And of course, if some, I would imagine, were developed by local actors, I think that would be particularly interesting for us to know about.
100%. So, I mean, the good news, insofar as there can be any good news out of a terrible global crisis, is that every organization has had to adapt in one way or another to COVID-19. And we have seen some organizations doing particularly well, especially, you know, on things like civil military cooperation, which is so vital to protection in conflict affected states, with, you know, security forces, a wide range of security forces pulled into the enforcement of the pandemic. The way that they do that is so important to making sure that protection remains on the agenda. And we saw, you know, some militaries in eastern Ukraine. I'm pleased to have Colonel Karpov with us today. The army was there on standby to provide surge medical capacity, for example, if hospitals in the area became overwhelmed, a capability that I think, thankfully, they haven't had to use yet, but it's certainly a massive reassurance to civilians on the ground that they're there in that case. Similarly, in Afghanistan, we had, you know, the police hospital in Balkh opening its doors to the civilian population to allow them to be treated alongside police and their families, which is a big benefit. I mean, the public hospital in the area only having the capacity to treat, you know, a couple of hundred people. And, you know, civics community coalitions really pivoted as well towards providing an important role, both in linking up local communities with international healthcare providers, medical assistance, humanitarian assistance during this time, but also working really closely with the military and the police on the ground in areas where they were enforcing lockdowns to make sure that, you know, protection concerns were raised quickly. Any confusion was sorted out over the implementation of curfews, both to ensure that, you know, those direct impacts of lockdown enforcement on civilian harm were reduced, but also to make sure that, you know, long-standing trust wasn't broken between communities during the lockdown. The other thing as well on training and engagement, I mean, we saw some local forces, international partners, and local civil society organizations really stepping up their efforts to make sure that frontline responders to the pandemic received the training, information, and the support that they needed to mitigate civilian harm while enforcing movement restrictions in fragile contexts. So civics country teams each moved their training with local militaries online. We had international militaries running their training exercises with partner forces completely virtually. And we had some international missions, you know, really finding the flexibility within their existing mandates to engage directly on issues of civilian harm that they were seeing unfold. For example, running additional workshops on public order policing to kind of counter, you know, some of the uses of violence that were being used against protesters while enforcing curfews and lockdowns. Just to give you an example from civics country teams in Nigeria, community protection groups really stepping up their work with local radio stations to ensure that their message on civilian protection could get through even while movement restrictions made it more difficult to travel around conflict affected areas. They moved all of their training modules that they would usually give face-to-face online, and delivered them over the radio on weekly broadcasts in local languages on both civilian and military networks, which also gave communities a real opportunity to have a dialogue over those channels, calling in, participating, raising protection concerns from ongoing operations as they are unfolded. So providing quite an innovative solution to making sure that that dialogue could continue even with restrictions in place for COVID-19. And then I think the last thing I'll mention is the wonderful organizations doing civilian casualty tracking, who, you know, many of them really showed a huge amount of resilience, moving entire monitoring networks online, using, you know, phone calls with populations in affected areas, triangulating sources using social media and additional phone conversations to ensure that actually that capability to track and understand civilian harm in those areas wasn't hugely affected during the pandemic. So just to conclude with, you know, two sort of big lessons that I think it'd be interesting to reflect on and to hear questions from the audience as well. I mean, we really saw throughout COVID-19 a huge range of security forces and civilian administrations being pulled into the pandemic response. You know, everyone from border guards, local police, national police, gendarme, National Guard, militaries being pulled in. So I think, you know, for us making sure that every force and every unit that has the capability or the potential to be used in a frontline context in a global health crisis gets that protection of civilians, that IHL training and support that they need before a crisis. And then also understanding and planning for that potential disproportionate impact of global health crises on vulnerable populations to ensure that those risk factors for civilian harm are mitigated to the greatest possible extent when planning assistance and programming in fragile and conflict affected states. But I know that we're really short on time, so I'll leave my remarks there, but I really look forward to the discussion, and it's an absolute pleasure to be with you all this morning.
Emily, thank you so much to you, and thank you so much for sharing those preliminary findings as well as your main lessons and takeaways. Dear colleagues, we are now entering into the third phase of this event, which is the Q&A, the question and answers. I'm sure that we have many questions already lined up. If I may, we have colleagues who have already shared their interest to make a statement from the floor. So I will start by calling on them. Our first speaker is from Save the Children, Ukraine, Yasminka Milovanovic, who is the head of advocacy for Save the Children in Ukraine. Yasminka would really very much like to share the experience of Save the Children Ukraine in implementing the Safe School Declaration, including the
good morning to all of you. I hope
Sorry.
that you can hear me. I'm
Yes.
actually
Yes,
from
Yasminka, we
east
can hear you.
of Ukraine.
We can hear
Great.
you, Yasminka. Very good. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm glad to have a chance to speak about our collaboration between Save the Children and Civic. So just a very few information about what we do and how much we are collaborating. I will start with saying that since 2017, Save the Children has been advocating with the government of Ukraine for endorsement and implementation of the Safe Schools Declaration. So Safe Schools Declaration and the guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use during armed conflict are the only international documents, as you all know, dedicated exclusively to the safety of schools, children and teachers in the context of armed conflicts. So in November 2019, a year and a half ago, thanks to our extensive advocacy with the Minister of Education, presidential administration here in Ukraine, including the Presidential Commissioner for Child Rights, Ukraine endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration and became the 100th country in the world which adopted this very important document for Ukraine. So with endorsement of the Safe Schools Declaration, government of Ukraine now commits to take very concrete steps to ensure better protection for education, including monitoring and reporting of attacks on education and the military use of schools, assisting victims of attacks, prosecuting perpetrators, and promoting measures that enable safe education to continue during war, as well as using the guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use during armed conflict. So after the endorsement, after that, November 2019, when we celebrated becoming the 100th country in the world, Save the Children started to support developing the Safe Schools Declaration National Implementation Plan together with the government of Ukraine and partners. And that plan is now in its final phase. We lobbied for setting up interministerial working group, and that working group is going to be that driving force that will actually translate the Safe Schools Declaration into something that communities and children could feel. So talking about partnership with Civic, which is the main focus of my address this morning, one of the very first Safe Schools Declaration related implementation activities we worked on in collaboration with the Ministry of Defense and of course Civic is a serial of trainings for civil military cooperation officers, and that was carried out in December 2019. So less than a month after the endorsement. At that stage, more than 50 officers from the general staff and all the brigades acting in the conflict zone in eastern Ukraine attended the training on the Safe Schools Declaration and the guidelines for protecting schools and universities from military use during armed conflict. Since they are the frontline workers who are in contact with children and communities in Eastern Ukraine, they need to know and they need to learn how to protect them in the situation of conflict. So I'm happy to say that by now, we have had a serial of trainings of nearly 110 civil military officers during online and offline trainings. Part of our pipeline plan is to educate a group of 1,000 civil military officers in collaboration with CIVIC. We also agreed about having at least 5 and possibly more offline trainings on the Safe Schools Declaration and the guidelines starting from October this year, October 2021, as part of the same collaboration. In the nearest future, actually in less than 2 weeks from now, beginning of July, we are planning to have a session at the National Defense University in Kiev for students and lecturers on the Safe Schools Declaration and the guidelines, which will be an entry point for achieving Save the Children's long-term goal in incorporating the Safe Schools Declaration and the guidelines in the Defense University's curriculum. So that's also part of the CIVIC collaboration. And these are just some of the key highlights illustrating collaboration between CIVIC and Save the Children. I will definitely not go into our collaboration with CIVIC regarding the National Protection of Civilians strategy. CIVIC is championing in Ukraine, and consultations will constantly have on a number of initiatives related to this important policy on one side and on the other, Safe Schools Declaration implementation. We plan to continue working with the Ministry of Defense and CIVIC as we consider them as the key stakeholders in the Safe Schools Declaration implementation. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jasminka. The next speaker is my dear colleague Andre, who is the humanitarian counselor for humanitarian affairs at the Permanent Mission of Netherlands here in Geneva. I can see him appear on the screen. Andre, go ahead. There you are.
Yes, thank you very much, Anne, and thank you for moderating this panel. Very interesting. And let me start by thanking through you, Switzerland, for co-hosting, also and co-organizing this week's ECOSOC Haas. Much appreciated. Thank you for that. I'm not sure I'm going to have answers to the 4 very pertinent questions you gave us at the beginning, but exactly those questions go to show how important it is, I think, to look at also this matter in a very practical manner. But I want to take the opportunity maybe to give some 3 reasons, I guess, for why the Netherlands wanted to co-sponsor this event. I guess, first of all, to highlight the importance of international humanitarian law in general. You know, we see humanitarian needs grow. We speak a lot about the root causes, and then we speak about conflict, about climate, and now about COVID. But what we have to keep repeating ourselves, I think, it's that, you know, we're providing humanitarian assistance, and that first and foremost is about protecting civilians, I would say, and that goes a long way to also, you know, addressing root causes. So it's about protecting civilians, it's about upholding international humanitarian law, and it's about, I guess, implementing it, and as some also said, holding breaches, holding accountability for breaches of international humanitarian law. So in that respect, I want to thank CIVIC for organizing this event, and the panelists for their very practical and implementation-oriented approach to the matter. And thanks CIVIC also for the cooperation we have with them, both in the Netherlands. I know they are working with our Ministry of Defense on a roadmap to address civilian harm in Dutch military efforts, but also internationally in different countries in terms of protecting civilians. Secondly, I wanted to highlight the importance of the principles of international humanitarian law when it comes to, you know, combating the COVID pandemic. You know, we are learning as we go along that curtailing the pandemic is only possible if all people are protected against the disease. So that also includes people in harm's way, such as refugees, migrants, and IDPs. And this is not only an obligation under international humanitarian law, and not only about the pandemic, but disease in general, to protect people in harm's way against them. But we now also see it's clearly in everybody's interest if this is done, including those that hold power or control territories. Which brings me to my third and final point, the obligation under IHL to protect civilians, which is as a matter of fact, a cornerstone of international humanitarian law. And this applies to all warring actors, state and non-state actors. And this means, for instance, that those controlling or occupying territories should ensure public health in those territories that they control without discriminating between people. And that's not only a question of international humanitarian law, but also basic human rights. But I think we can even go a step further in that, and maybe I will attach a question to that for, I guess, the panelists, and I'll leave it to the panelists to see who wants to answer that. But, you know, going a step further, I guess protecting civilians is one thing, but I think that also is maybe a stepping stone for involving civilians and civil organizations in the planning and policy, and in generally taking control of their lives, even though in a crisis situation. And I'm particularly thinking about you know, women and girls and women-led organizations. I think that's a prerequisite also for getting out of crisis and towards sustainable peace. So maybe my question, and I'll close with that, is, you know, how, you know, do we see, or how do we see transition from this very practical approach to protecting civilians and involving civilians in that towards, you know, maybe down the line a more sustainable relationship between armed non-state and state armed actors in their relationship with civilians and civilian organizations. But thank you.
Thank you to you, Andriy. Thank you so much for your support, and of course, as co-sponsor of the event. You have put forward to us a very fascinating question. I know that we are running a bit short of time, but I still wanted to check with our very distinguished panelists. I saw some of our panelists nodding very interestingly to your question, Andriy. So maybe you want to give some initial feedback. I don't want to put you in the spot, Major Laplante, but I did see you nod. So I was wondering, maybe you had some elements of response that you wanted to share with our colleague Andriy.
Yes, thank you. I think that there's some excellent points that were brought up in there. And bringing in a military perspective, I would like to speak specifically to, you know, kind of mobilizing the key personnel and the roles that we take in terms of military action. So what the Dallaire Center of Excellence, again, is thinking in that strategic space and trying to bring people together. And this includes consulting with experts in the field. So you mentioned involvement of civil society organizations and groups on the ground, such as women's organizations, et cetera. This is part of the thinking space that we are currently working in the Dallaire Center of Excellence. So for example, we recognize that military efforts must be part of an integrated approach. You know, for example, working across the rest of the mission, working with other agencies. So we cannot remain in a military-centric bubble. And this is the mindset that we're going in to our current work with. We want to make sure that we reach out and we bring in these different perspectives into our analysis to make sure that we're not, to make sure that we're avoiding essentially a confirmation bias. And I also want to mention, for example, other academics that are also working in these thematic areas. You know, we all need to work hand in hand. And part of the work that we have done is actually reach out to different scholars from across the world to get those perspectives to make sure that this works. And the final thing that I will mention is that is recognizing the gendered nature of conflict in conflict settings. So myself in my role as a gender advisor to the Canadian Defence Academy, we are working specifically on integrating gender perspectives into our training and education that is PANCAF, so that common education piece. And we realize that we need to understand the differences in experiences, so of youth as child soldiers, but also the population more broadly, in order to be able to better work towards our objectives and our Canadian Forces doctrine and training in specific. And we continue to share this knowledge as well as broadly as we can to make sure that we're going for a whole of government approach and also an international collaborative approach. Thank you.
Major, thank you so much for this excellent contribution. And I think we would still have loads of questions to continue to address. I fear that we are starting to run slightly out of time. And of course, I want to leave enough time for our distinguished last speaker for his concluding remarks. Before I hand him the floor, of course, it's also my pleasure to very warmly thank our distinguished panelists for their excellent contribution, for their availability to be with us this morning, for also our co-sponsors, our participants. And with that, it is my great privilege to introduce our last speaker. I think many of you know him here in Geneva, His Excellency Nazir Ahmad Andisha, who is the ambassador for the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan to the UN in Geneva. Ambassador, we're delighted to have you with us this morning, and I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Let me begin by thanking you and all colleagues who participated and organized today's discussion. I think it's a very timely and relevant topic, and I personally learned a lot from the interventions and the presentations, and I'm really glad that I have my compatriots from the civil society from Herat who really gave an in-depth and at the field level analysis of what's happening in Afghanistan. Of course, also we listened to Ukraine and the other places. So my colleagues prepared a very long 3-4 pages concluding remarks, but I'm not going to read that because it seems that most of these things will become irrelevant because we had very rich discussion today. I wanted to generally maybe to do sort of a general wrap up of our session today because the discussions were very much in detail. So I'll say that that the implementation of the international humanitarian law and the avoiding civilian casualties in the time of conflict, which a number of countries representing here they are facing. So in this time, at the time of conflict and the time of war, to me, it seemed that is directly related to our work, the work of the states, NGOs, international organizations, in terms of advocacy, capacity building, and dialogue at the time of peace. So, and relative peace in the context of countries like mine. So if we really try hard on those times, the result will be a protection of the international humanitarian law and the avoiding of civilian casualties at the time of war. So it is very relevant to discuss it here in Geneva and also in many countries and many capitals at the time of peace. So that's number one. And number two is that in the context of contemporary conflicts and the wars, it's becoming even more difficult that we advocate for protection of civilians and for the promotion and respect for international humanitarian law, because most of the conflicts today are intra-state conflict. And an intra-state conflict, it's always involves a non-state actor, which is very difficult to deal with. And the asymmetry of conflict makes it easier for the party which does not respect these rules and regulations, does not protect civilians, in fact uses civilians as shields, as human shields, to gain short-term successes. So that's why it's another difficulty, it's another challenge of of the work that you're all doing, and also as a states that we are doing. So now, certainly, talking about this brings me to a specific case of Afghanistan. While the civil society perspective was given by Mr. Sadat from Herat, I can tell you about what is some of the practices, some of the good practices that we have put forward in Afghanistan with the help of international organizations, with the help of state parties, and the help of NGOs, including CIVIC, which is doing a very good job there in Afghanistan. So the problem of civilian casualties in the conflict in Afghanistan has been, you know, one of the perhaps one of the major areas of contentions within the community, within the society, and also at the state level. Since 2009, when there was a number of, you know, collateral damages and civilian casualties due to these NATO operations in Afghanistan, I think the issue of civilian casualties brought up to the highest level of the government, and this is where we tried all our best to use all means possible in our hand, but also in the hands of our partners from the NATO, which are now leaving, and this is another discussion maybe for future, that what will be the situation of civilian casualties when the NATO forces are not in Afghanistan, and the conflicts are intensifying every day. So that was also alluded by my colleague from Herat. So there we started our effort, and fast forward, I'll not go to the more of the details. In 2017, we started and basically we established a landmark national policy framework that highlights government's respect and promotion of both international humanitarian law and also protection of civilian. So what this policy guideline the government recommitted, of course, our government was that the government forces to mitigate and respond to civilian harm through what? Through training, policies, and also financial assistance to the victims. And then this specific policy, which was 2017 called National Policy on Prevention and Mitigation of Civilian Harm, it's actually endorsed by our National Security Council, and it sends specific guidelines to our military forces, or security forces, in 3 stages: in pre-operation stages, during the operation, and post-operation. So I think the results have been very clear, and there are data there that the UNAMA's UN office in Afghanistan has reported that, you know, given this specific guidelines, there have been a visible impact on the ground in terms of civilian casualties, and some of them was also mentioned by the intervention from Afghanistan, from Herat, where the use of artilleries, the use of heavy weapons have been highly regulated in our national security force. So of course, it puts our forces in disadvantage, but when it comes to this promotion and protection of international law and reduction of civilian harm, I think states are much more responsible, and this is what you have to do, and to have to make ourselves as a role model, so with which we can later on push the non-state actors. So it's basically also obliged our agencies within the National Security Forces of Afghanistan that in the case of civilian casualties, which, you know, unfortunately happens once in a while, that there should be prompt and thorough investigation, but also corrective measures has to be taken, because every time you face with a new sort of civilian casualties and the difficulties of this sort, so you have to reevaluate your policies, you have to look into it deeply and to see where are some of the flaws and to correct that. So I think that's another part. And that's why, so every time we do this, there is a change, there is an adoption into the rules of engagement and targeting within the national security forces of Afghanistan. And of course, you know, beside this, there is a specific department which records the casualties, and on this we are very active. You know, as a state here in Geneva, we sponsored together with Liechtenstein, Croatia, and Costa Rica a joint statement in the Human Rights Council on the casualty recording, and then of course Afghanistan and Spain. In New York, we were the co-sponsors of victims of terrorism, which, you know, has a specific relationship to what we are discussing today. So there are measures in terms of compensations for the families of the victims, for people who or the casualties of this sort of civilian casualties, but at the same time to people who are wounded, there is specific amounts that the government delivers. So, that's basically what the policy is, and as I said, that there is a sort of a feedback mechanism that through many other civil society stakeholders, our human rights commission, to the NGOs and civil society. So when the feedback reaches us and the government, we every time we try to adjust it and to reduce casualties. But this is actually what is happening up to now. So I wanted to end my this concluding remarks is that this, like many other fields, is a constant, is a field of constant learning. I know I can't even dare call it trial and error, because every trial will cost civilians, and the civilian casualty is something that we should all avoid. But it's the work of civil society, the work of NGOs on the ground. They're very valuable because of the feedbacks that you can get from them. Is something that is always helpful and useful, both for the states and for the non-state actors. And that's even more pressing at the current situation, where there is, and it seems to be even more of a sort of a security gap, a removal of the NATO forces from Afghanistan, a complete withdrawal of them, removes also an international partner, which of course in the past mistakes have been committed even by them, but with all the standards of protection of humanitarian law and reduction of civilian casualties, they were responsible partners. So what is left on the ground is some local forces which can which are needed to fill the gap, because of course from the Taliban side there's very little that one should expect. I know that there are a number of NGOs that they are trying to work with them, trying to make them accountable, but of course, as I said, they use this asymmetry, and these recent attacks in a number of dozens of districts in Afghanistan shows that there is no respect or regard whatsoever to international humanitarian law or to civilian casualties, because they are very open evidence of them using civilians as shield and also operating from inside people's house while the people, children, women are living in those houses. I think in the province of Baghlan, we have videos of this. So in this kind of situation, it's even more pressing, it's even more challenging, but at the same time, even more imperative and important for all of us to use the experiences that we had so far, and to reinforce and to redouble our efforts, that we should not create any kind of a situation or even a perception that since the international forces are not there, then there is more possibility of civilian casualties, and then of course there won't be any sort of accountability to this. So that's what we are trying to do, to raise awareness at the Geneva level, to focus on the protection of civilians here in Geneva. And this is our job as a mission here, and we're working with a cross number of NGOs, international organizations, and some of these member states to keep the profile of protection in Afghanistan high, especially at this fighting season. So we are working, with Civic, with other colleagues here, to have, follow-up discussions at the margins of the Human Rights Council. So with this, I thank you very much, and I wish you a very good weekend for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Excellency, and thank you very much to all our distinguished panelists, speakers, participants, to the organizers of the ECOSOC, and of course a very big thank you to our moderator Anderik Matan for helping us facilitate this conversation today. It was a really important conversation for all of us. I think Ambassador Andisha really much highlighted the importance of addressing the question of civilian casualties, preventing them, responding to them, in the context of an increased collaboration that's needed between government, civilians, and military actors. So with this, we will close this side event. Apologies for the slight delay in that we're incurring. Just would like to mention that all the conversation, the very rich conversation that we have had today are going to be part of the ECOSOC report, the ECOSOC HAS report. We will also be producing a 2-pager that's going to be available very soon on the OCHA website. And I really would like to thank the variety of participants who have been online, who are still online right now. We've had participants from governments, from the field, from partner NGOs, also from NATO, who is online today and with whom we are launching very soon a publication precisely on the reinforcement of civilian harm mitigation practices in security force assistance. So thank you very much again to all of you, and we hope this is the kickoff of a conversation to try and continue increase the profile of and the agenda of the protection of civilians in Geneva, New York, in capitals, but also first and foremost in the field. Thank you so much.